The moment my grandson laughed and said the little diner outside Roswell looked like a place nobody in their right mind would ever stop at, I felt something inside me fold in on itself the way an old map does when the creases have been bent too many times. We had pulled off the highway mostly because the kids needed to stretch their legs. Early 2000s, I suppose it must have been around 2003 or so. My daughter was driving the big station wagon, and the desert road had been stretching out ahead of us for hours, two thin lanes cutting through pale brown land that rolled flat toward a distant horizon like the surface of a quiet ocean made of dust. The sign was what caught my eye first. Even before the car slowed down, I recognized the shape of it against the sky. That old neon frame stood crooked beside the road, the letters half gone, the paint faded down to a chalky pink from years of sun and wind. The word diner still clung to the metal, though the N leaned sideways like it was tired of standing. I hadn't seen it in nearly 20 years. My daughter didn't know. None of them did. The wagon rolled into the empty lot with the crunch of gravel under the tires, and the engine clicked softly as it cooled. The desert wind slid through the place the way it always had, slow and steady, carrying little ribbons of sand across the cracked asphalt where parking lines had long ago faded into ghostly streaks. For a minute nobody said much. Then the kids started talking. "Well," my grandson said with a little laugh, stepping out and stretching his arms toward the sky, "this place looks like it came straight out of a ghost town movie." My granddaughter squinted at the building. The windows were dusty now, filmed over with years of wind-blown sand. One of them had a corner cracked like a spiderweb. The screen door hung crooked on its hinge, and every few seconds the breeze pushed it open just enough for it to creak before it settled again. "Did people actually eat here?" she asked. I stayed quiet inside the car a moment longer. The smell of the desert came in through the open window, dry earth, sun-baked weeds, and the faint metallic scent that always lives in places where the wind has been scraping the land for a long time. My daughter shut off the engine and glanced toward the building. "Probably a truck stop once," she said casually. "These old roadside places used to be everywhere." My grandson walked toward the front of the diner, kicking lightly at a drift of sand that had gathered against the concrete step. "I mean, look at it," he said. "It's tiny. Hard to believe anyone made a living out of something like this." I stepped out of the car then. The air felt warm against my face, the kind of late afternoon heat the desert keeps stored up even when the sun begins sliding lower toward the horizon. No one was looking at me. They were busy wandering around the lot, taking pictures, pointing at the old neon sign the way people do when they find something that feels strange and forgotten. Someone said, "They should probably tear it down." Another voice chimed in, "Yeah, imagine putting something modern here. Like a big travel stop or a gas station." I didn't say anything. Instead, I started walking. The gravel shifted softly beneath my shoes as I crossed the lot. In my mind I could still see the old painted parking lines the way they had looked decades ago when they were bright and straight, when farm pickups and long-haul trucks lined up here before sunrise like quiet animals waiting for morning. The wind brushed past my ears with that low desert whisper. When I reached the building, I laid my hand against the brick wall. The surface felt rough and warm from the sun. For a moment I just stood there. It's a strange thing how a place can hold time inside it. Even when everything changes, even when windows crack and paint fades and doors sag on their hinges, something underneath stays exactly the same. The screen door creaked again. I could almost hear the bell that used to hang above it. Back then, every time someone stepped inside, that bell would ring out clear as a church note, and the sound would bounce off the tile floor and the chrome edges of the counter stools. The door would swing open. Cold winter air would spill in. And someone would call out, "Morning, Frank." That was my name behind the counter. Frank. I walked slowly along the side of the building. Sand had gathered in little dunes along the wall. The windows were clouded now, but if I leaned close enough I could still see shapes inside, the outline of the long counter, the row of stools bolted into the floor, the old coffee machine that had once hissed and steamed from 4 in the morning until well past noon. Behind me, the kids were still talking. Their voices floated across the lot in pieces carried by the wind. "Look at these old parking stripes. Man, trucks must have been huge back then. Imagine stopping here in the middle of nowhere." I smiled a little at that. Middle of nowhere. That's what places like this always look like to people who arrive too late. I rounded the corner of the building. The back door was still there, paint peeled down to bare wood in places, the handle rusted, the frame tilted just slightly where the desert ground had shifted over the years. This was where I used to step outside during the slow hours. Usually around mid-afternoon, after the breakfast rush had passed and before the evening drivers started rolling through. I would stand right here, leaning against the wall, wiping my hands on a towel while the wind moved across the empty land. Sometimes the smell of frying bacon would still cling to my clothes. Sometimes the radio inside would drift out through the open window, soft country music crackling through static. And inside, she would be laughing at something one of the truckers said. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them again, the desert was quiet. My grandson called out from the front of the building. "Grandpa." His voice echoed slightly across the empty lot. "You coming over here?" I walked back around the corner. They had all gathered near the neon sign now. The metal pole cast a long shadow across the cracked pavement as the sun dipped lower behind the desert hills. My granddaughter was brushing dust off her jeans. My daughter was looking at the building the way people do when they're trying to imagine what something used to be. And my grandson, he had that curious expression young people get when they suddenly remember the older person standing beside them might actually know something about the world before they were born. He nodded toward the diner. "Hey Grandpa," he said. "You ever eat at a place like this back in the day?" I stopped beside the sign. The neon tubes buzzed faintly, though they hadn't lit in years. The wind moved softly across the lot. And for a moment I simply looked at the building. Then my grandson tilted his head a little and asked the question that made the whole desert seem to go quiet. What was it really like running a place like this back then? For a moment I didn't answer. The wind slid across the open land behind us, carrying that low desert sound that always reminds me of waves rolling across a distant shore. The old neon tubes above our heads gave off a faint electric hum, like a memory trying to stay alive inside a broken machine. I looked at the diner. The sunlight had turned softer now, the kind that spreads gold across the desert just before evening settles in. "Well," I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected it to be, "it wasn't much to look at even back then." The kids shifted a little closer. Nobody laughed this time. "Place opened before sunrise," I went on. 4:30 most mornings. Sometimes earlier in winter. My grandson glanced at the dusty windows again. 4:30, he said. I nodded. You'd be surprised how many people are already awake when the rest of the world still thinks it's night. I could almost see it again. The dark highway stretching empty under the stars. The diner windows glowing warm yellow against the cold desert air. Steam rising from coffee cups while frost clung to the truck windshields outside. Truckers mostly, I said. Farm guys too. Men coming off night shifts from the feed plant down the road. I rested my hand on the pole of the neon sign. The mornings were the busiest. Always the coldest time of day too. You'd hear the engines coming before you saw the headlights. Big rigs rolling in slow, tires crunching over the gravel just like your mom's car did a little while ago. I smiled faintly. Door would swing open and that little bell would ring. Cold air rushing in with them. Coats covered in road dust. Hands half frozen. My granddaughter leaned against the signpost, listening. What did you cook? She asked. Oh, I said softly, same things most diners did. Eggs. Pancakes. Biscuits and gravy. Bacon that sizzled loud enough to wake the dead. A little laugh moved through the group. And coffee, I added. Always coffee. I must have poured 10,000 cups of coffee in that place. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of dry weeds from the empty land beyond the highway. There was a radio behind the counter, I said. Little silver one. Picked up a country station from somewhere out near Albuquerque. Reception wasn't great, but it played all day long. I could hear it again in my head, soft guitar, voices drifting through static while the grill hissed and plates clinked against the counter. And there was this girl who worked the morning shift, I said. My daughter looked over at me. Her face had changed a little. Your mother, I said gently. The kid straightened. She started waitressing here when she was 19. Drove in from town every morning before the sun came up. The memory warmed my chest the same way it always had. She had this habit, I continued, of humming along with the radio while she carried the coffee pot around. Never loud. Just under her breath. My granddaughter smiled. That sounds like Grandma. It was, I said. The desert grew quieter as the sun slipped lower. The long shadows stretched across the lot where trucks once sat idling while men warmed their hands around mugs. Running a place like this wasn't glamorous, I said after a moment. Long hours. Grease on the floor. Dishes stacked higher than your elbows. I rubbed my thumb slowly across the metal of the signpost. But people depended on it. My grandson frowned slightly. What do you mean? I looked out toward the highway. A car passed far in the distance, the sound of its engine drifting faintly through the air before disappearing again. There were years when money was tight in this part of the country, I said. Crop seasons that didn't turn out right. Layoffs at the plant. I paused. Some mornings a man would sit down at that counter with only enough cash for a cup of coffee. The kids stayed quiet. And sometimes, I went on, that coffee came with eggs and toast anyway. My daughter lowered her eyes a little. Your grandma used to slide the plate down the counter like it was nothing special, I said. Never said a word about it. I could see her clearly now, apron tied at the waist, pencil tucked behind her ear, smile warm enough to melt the frost off a windshield. People remember things like that, I said. The wind lifted a loose strip of paper near the building and carried it across the lot. Funny thing about small places, I continued. They don't just feed people. They hold pieces of their lives. I pointed toward the diner windows. Truckers celebrated paydays there. Farmers sat at that counter arguing about weather forecasts. Kids passing through on road trips got their first taste of real diner pancakes. I looked back at them. And on more than one winter night, when the roads iced over and the town power went out, we kept that place open so folks had somewhere warm to sit. The desert had grown very still. Even the wind seemed to have stepped back for a moment. My grandson glanced slowly from me to the building. You worked here a long time, he asked quietly. Almost 20 years, I said. His eyes widened. I nodded toward the diner. I built it. No one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. Before, it had been the quiet of a forgotten place. Now it felt like the quiet inside a church. My granddaughter turned slowly toward the building again. You mean, she said, her voice barely above the breeze, this was yours? I nodded. For a long time. The kids stared at the cracked windows as if the whole place had suddenly shifted shape. My grandson rubbed the back of his neck. Oh, he said. That was all. Just that small word. But the laughter from earlier had vanished. We stood there a while longer, the sunset washing soft orange light across the desert and the faded sign above us. Finally my daughter spoke. You never told us. I shrugged gently. There wasn't much to tell. She looked at the diner again. There's a lot to tell. I shook my head with a quiet smile. Not really. It was just a diner. The wind returned then, brushing through the lot and stirring sand across the pavement where thousands of boots once walked in before sunrise. I looked at the building one more time. The windows were dark now. The screen door creaked softly in the evening air. And for a moment I could almost see the lights glowing again, hear the bell above the door, smell fresh coffee drifting out across the desert while engines idled in the cold. But places move on. Time does too. My grandson stepped closer beside me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at the diner with a different expression now, one that carried a kind of quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. After a while he spoke. Must have meant a lot to people. I watched the sun slip below the horizon. The desert settled into that deep evening stillness it always finds after the wind finally grows tired. Well, I said softly, it kept a few folks warm on cold mornings. That was enough. We walked back to the car soon after. The gravel crunched again under our feet the same way it had for decades. No applause followed us. No grand speeches. Just the quiet desert, the fading light, and an old building standing beside a lonely road. And as we drove away, I watched the neon sign grow smaller in the side mirror until it became just another shape against the wide New Mexico sky. A man doesn't always get to see the full measure of the life he lived. Most of the time it disappears quietly into the years behind him. But every once in a while, if the wind is right and the road curves just the right way, the past waits beside the highway long enough for you to remember that even the smallest places can hold the center of someone's world.